recovery is really going to look like. I've got a great panel here with Schroders and guest speaker. Schroders Personal Wealth have been fantastic supporters of IoD, and we'll continue to thank you for that support as we go on. And without further ado, let me just turn over, before I do turn over to Lee Dunkley, you'll be able to ask questions, and I know most of you are not slow at coming forward, so please do put your questions into the effective chat box, and the panel will pick up those questions and answer as many of them as they possibly can. So without further ado, let me pass over to Lee Dunkley from Schroders. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, Aidan. And thank you, everybody, for joining today's webinar. It's great to be talking on a subject that actually a lot of us are so passionate about. And as Aidan said, is financial wellbeing is top of the agenda, I think, not just for individuals, but for families, for businesses, and for the UK as a whole as we transition, as Aidan said, through 2020 and into 2021. My name's Lee Dunkley. I am the Financial Wellbeing Lead at Schroders Personal Wealth. We are a financial planning company at heart, but we have the core strategic aim of improving financial well-being of individuals across the UK through making advice more accessible to more people. And before I kind of hand over to our fantastic panel, I just wanted to take 5 or 10 minutes, I guess, to bring financial well-being to life and give you a bit of context as to why we're here talking about it today. So if we go on to the next slide, I thought it'd be, quite good to start off with actually what financial well-being is. So quite often when I'm out there speaking to individuals and employers, asking the question, what does financial well-being mean to you? Quite often the responses center around, I want a promotion, I want a bigger paycheck, I want more money. And absolutely, whilst having more money will allow you to buy more things, it absolutely will not give you that sense of financial well-being or that sense of happiness. Actually, what financial well-being really means is it's about giving people that financial education, that understanding, giving them that power to make a financial plan that's really going to give them that confidence and control, allowing them to obtain financial freedom and really prioritize what's important to kind of each and every individual across the UK. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about financial well-being. If we skip to the next slide. So actually, at Schroders Personal Wealth, we've done a lot of research on this topic. And actually last year, we launched our inaugural Money and Mind report, where we looked at data, research and survey responses of thousands of people across the UK to really understand what's going on with the nation's finances. And we were able to come up with the nation's financial health score, which you can see there was calculated at 52 out of 100. But we wanted to take that down a level, and we actually split the score then into 4 different sections. And that really highlighted, I guess, this contrast between how people say they feel about their finances versus actually what their finances are showing and telling us about how they're managing things. And there's 2 stark contrasts. And the first one is really around this idea of day-to-day finances. So when we look at day-to-day finances, which is the first 2 angles, the getting the basics right and debt management, managing my borrowing. Actually, as individuals, we're scoring really highly with 20 and 24 out of 25 being the scores. But what's happening is then when we're looking to the future, so when we look at the scores against protecting against the unexpected, which is just 3 out of 25, and planning for the future, which is just 5 out of 25, we see that there's a real issue here in terms of people feel confident about planning for their future. So planning for things like retirement and what they want to do in later life. And that's something that actually all of us on this call can have a real impact on, is how can we drive up those scores to really improve the confidence and financial well-being of people across the UK. Now, when we talk about finances, we can't just talk about them in the literal sense of debt management or mortgages or pensions. Actually, there's a number of underlying themes and cross-cutting lenses that part of today's session will really draw out. So there's 4 that we wanted to highlight today. The first of which is the UK advice gap. So actually, we have a real issue across the UK around people being able to access really affordable financial advice to help them with starting to make a plan. The second one is around the financial literacy of people within the UK, and there's a real issue here as well. So how do we start to bring financial education, into our younger generations? How do we take it into schools, through universities, and ultimately into the workplace, again, to instill that confidence? Theme number 3 that we want to bring out is this intrinsic link between finances and the other strands of well-being, particularly mental health, and I'll touch on that more in a moment. And the final one is around gender and ethnicity disparity. We know that these core things that make us who we are absolutely play a part in how we engage and how we understand things like our finances. So we really need to take that into consideration when we talk about the broad theme of financial well-being. And moving on to the next slide. So bringing this back to the workplace, because that's why we're here. You guys as directors and within your line of work, actually, what does financial health in the workplace mean? And this is where I wanted to draw out some of those key stats from our report from last year. So the first one is 48%. 48% of UK adults feel regularly or occasionally stressed due to their financial situation. So that's 1 in 2 people. Now, if we think back and link that to mental health, the key stat that we all know is the 1 in 4. Actually, when we look at financial well-being and financial health, it's 1 in 2. And this word stress keeps coming up time and time again. So really, our finances are so intrinsically linked to our mental health. So when we're looking at this, we need to look at that well-being picture in the round and how can we improve it. So we know that 1 in 2 people are feeling stressed and anxious about their finances, but actually only 3% have ever shared their worries with their employer. Now, to me personally, this is really quite a shocking statistic, because actually our place of work is where we accrue most of our wealth. It's where we get our salaries. It's where we get our workplace pensions, protection benefits, bonuses, commissions. So why wouldn't our employer be our kind of natural go-to if we were feeling any concerns around our financial matters? And for me, there's 2 reasons really why that is. The first is that as a nation, we don't like talking about money. Our finances are seen as complex. They're seen as personal. We don't want to share, when things are going bad or we're having concerns, we don't want to share that with anyone, let alone our employer. But really we need to start normalizing this conversation of money and finances. And the second point here is that as employers, you guys, you shouldn't have that expectation to be the experts in financial planning. You absolutely have a duty of care to be able to support and signpost support available to your employees. But there really is that fine line between providing education and guidance and providing advice. And that's a line that we don't want employers to be on the wrong side of. But that's where it's really important that organisations such as Schroders Personal Wealth, Scottish Widows and the Institute of Directors, amongst others, can really support you in this journey to support your employees and their financial well-being. It's not just about well-being though. There's a really compelling story here around productivity in your business. And that big stat there in the pink of 27% admit that money worries impact their performance at work. So if you put that into context, that's nearly 1/3 of every workforce across the UK saying that their performance at work is impacted by financial pressures. That's 1/3 of your workforce, spending time throughout the workday, thinking about their finances, looking for support, maybe contacting their banks or lenders, and they're not living their best life. They're not performing their best at work. And this can have a real, we hear about the word presenteeism, and this is exactly what it means. So actually, as employers and as workplaces, we can really improve this number by just implementing some support and some practical steps to really support our employees and ultimately have that real positive impact on the productivity of our employees and ultimately the bottom line commercials of our businesses. So moving on to the next slide, and I'm going to stop talking in a moment. Please, as Aidan said, please feel free to use the Q&A function. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love you to pose questions for our panel members. I'm delighted to announce that we're joined by 4 amazing guest speakers today. We've got John Watson, who is the interim chair for the Institute of Directors. We've got Jackie Leaper, who's the Managing Director, Workplace Savings from Lloyds Banking Group. We've got our very own Mark Duckworth, CEO of Schroders Personal Wealth. And we've also got Adrian Everett, Account Director at LinkedIn, who's going to be hosting the panel Q&A session for you today. So without further ado, I will stop sharing these slides and hand over to Adrian.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lee. And really thanks for setting the stage for the magnitude of the importance of financial health in the workplace. Thank you all for joining today. Also a massive thank you to Schroders Personal Wealth for hosting this session and really bringing such an important and relevant topic into focus in connection with the Institute of Directors. So let's dig right into the panel discussion and really start to explore our speakers' stories, their connection and passion for improving financial well-being for individuals, communities, and businesses throughout the UK. I'll say you guys are all in for a really engaging treat. So I'd like to kick off our conversation by asking each of our panelists to share a little bit of their story. More specifically, based on your roles and career history, why do you think financial well-being is important and why now? So I'll hand it over to you, John, to kick that off.
Thanks, Adrian. I'm delighted to be here today. I think this is a fabulous subject to discuss, and the work done by Schroders, I think, has really highlighted some of the key points which, as directors, we should really take notice of. It's a very private subject, financial well-being, and it's private for a very good reason. If we take Edinburgh, where both Aidan and I are based, a third of the children that live in poverty have working parents. And so these are people who are in our offices, in our organizations, genuinely worried about their children. And for me, I came from a very poor background, so it's really important to me that as a director, we put the effort in to try and help our employees who have financial stress. At the same time, we see that average savings or average cash reserves in the UK during COVID have increased by, on average, £12,500, which means there's a lot of cash tied up that we're going to need to invest, save, or spend in some way to help recoup in the economy. So I guess managing all that financial well-being of individuals for very real reasons and helping the growth of the economy is front of mind. And I'll just finish with one more other statistic. PwC have just issued a report for city economic reduction of 11% across the cities in the UK. Edinburgh's fared slightly better, only 9% reduction. But I doubt that slight improvement on economic reduction has helped those children who are living in poverty. And I think for me, the best thing we can do as directors is engage with our employees in order to help that section of our society.
That's really helpful and really great. Jackie, can you give us a little more context to your?
Yeah, sure, Adrian, thank you. I'm delighted to be here this morning. Good morning, everybody. So there's probably two elements that have brought me into this arena on financial wellbeing. So first is my day job, where I look after our workplace savings business at Scottish Widows, part of Lloyds Banking Group. And we do a lot of work with employers to support financial education, mainly building out from workplace pensions, which can be seen as quite a complex area. And certainly over the last couple of years, I've seen firsthand just how important employers are in engaging employees in this particular area. We see much more success where employers are sponsoring forward financial wellbeing initiatives and actually are building out that support for their workforce, recognising that actually there is a link to productivity, as Lee said, and to general happiness. So, I've seen lots of things that tell me employers can play a really important role in how they support their workforce. The second part is more a personal thing, where through this role, I've been able to get involved in some brilliant industry initiatives to really look at financial wellbeing, and in particular through the lens of inequalities. So over the last couple of years, I've been involved in some initiatives looking at gender gaps, for example, so both in terms of the gender pensions gap and just more generally the differences between men and women in their financial lives. And that's also led me into some of the other financial wellbeing. I've got a strong interest in family finances and how we really help close the differences. We heard there about some of the cash that exists during COVID. There's another half to that, where an awful lot of families have found themselves in an even worse situation because they they started out with very low levels of savings or financial resilience. So most recently, I've been working with the Money and Pension Service on their UK strategy for financial wellbeing. I feel very privileged to have had that opportunity. And in particular, I was supporting the gender element of it to make sure that their delivery plan, which they will announce in the next sort of month or so, really addresses some of those inequalities.
That's amazing. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Adrian. Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So for me, I've had just over 25 years actually within the financial services industry, both with manufacturers and distributors. And I think, and we'll come on, I think, to talk about this a little later, the access to advice for consumers is falling over that window. And when you work on and add to some of the facts that Lee gave us earlier so compellingly, in our Money in Mind report, 27% of respondents felt that money worries were affecting their performance at work, and by that very knock-on will it be affecting how they feel and behave in their personal lives. And I think what I've come to see over the last 25 years is the importance of a plan, whether you're wealthy, not wealthy, to have an understanding of your financial situation and what you want from your life, whether that is to provide more security, as most people have fears around finances, and I think John touched on that point. But more importantly, for me, it's about aspirations. Everyone has an aspiration, and just like John, my childhood was not flushed with wealth. So for me, I have a real passion to want to give more advice to more people, and that lack of access and how it's leaving people to feel for their own well-being isn't helping, because it's that sense of anticipation of having a plan with somebody who truly understands you and your financial needs and your well-being, and how that has a knock-on into your broader life. So really a very passionate topic for myself, Adrian.
That's amazing. And we're getting some questions in the chat around the financial education within the schools. I think it'd be really helpful for John and Mark if you guys could even just dig a little bit deeper into that, particularly around, I guess, the generation that's ready to go into work. How are we giving them that education? And even, I think this didn't come in the chat, but just the impact of COVID, as people are not in schools, like how are we getting this education information into the young people?
Sure. I think it's important that we address the question of education, not only in schools, but through the generational learning. When families understand their financial well-being, then children will understand their financial well-being. And I think from an IoD perspective, we certainly can help in that regard, because our members, some of them are struggling themselves, having not received financial support from the government, especially where they're owner directors, and have had to really look at their own financial situation. And I think it's important that when we're taking this time to reflect, we do recognize that how we feel as parents does impact our children, and we should take the opportunity to talk them through what we're thinking about in terms of our financial well-being, as well as our other well-being challenges, because I think it is recognized right now that I think the UK, as well as the rest of the world, is really struggling with the challenge of personal well-being.
Yeah. Do you want to go, Jackie? You go first.
Yeah, I thought I would just maybe come in and mention one of the things that the Money and Pension Service is looking to develop in this area, because they recognise catching people at an earlier stage as they're embarking on maybe further education or going into their first job is quite crucial. So one of the elements in the delivery plan is going to look at, could there be something more substantial in the national curriculum, and that's obviously across all the devolved nations, to build sort of basic financial skills, budgeting, managing money, that sort of really basic thing before you get into some of the planning stuff later in life. And then I think the second bit the Money and Pension Service are doing is galvanising actually some of the big financial providers, so the big banks, around the role of parents and the role of parents in supporting, educating their children, and starting to build some of those really good financial habits early on. On you go, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. So for me, I think in part, if we take a step back, it's somewhat societal. As Brits, we don't necessarily like to talk or be brash about money. And I think that's important, because if we think about our roles as directors and employers of people, it's vital that we give access and people understanding of all our employees about where they can get advice on financials and their financial well-being. And that support being accessible, but not only accessible, that we're communicating to our employees based on the style and demographic of the employees that we have. I think you just talked about, Adrienne, millennials. So it'd be pretty pointless talking, even if it were accessible, if we were talking about pensions and will writing. Yeah, if our workplace is somewhat of a younger demographic, we've got to really make sure it's accessible, but more importantly, relevant to our employees. And I think it's not solely the responsibility of employees, but I'd like to think that every one of us who's joined this webinar today has at least given the access, the portal through to some service or firms such as ours, to try and give that access to enhance that financial well-being that I think helps the overarching mental well-being, because it's not just Blue Monday on Monday and it's a tough time for most people in January. Hopefully we're taking the time at this moment to think, when you add COVID to the mix, everybody now should take that time to make sure that every single one of our employees has that access, that relevant communication to financial well-being information.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. And I think a little bit of everything that you all said kind of really draws into that destigmatization. And I think, John, you mentioned the importance of as parents, really kind of educating your kids. And I think, as parents, education is obviously huge, but also making sure that this is an open conversation. Like, we can talk about it, like being very open to having conversation around the sentiments of like financial well-being. And Jackie, just the availability of resources. So I'd be really keen to kind of learn more about when we can expect these resources to be widely available, because I think more conversation, more resources is going to make it more normal to kind of have it front of mind, be able to talk about it and really drive to financial well-being. So thank you guys all for that. So we're all on board to really destigmatize this amazing and important topic. I guess a lot of, on this call, I'm sure there's a ton of employers or people who are aligned with developing well-being strategies. Mark, you mentioned that overlap between mental well-being and financial well-being, which I think is just so important because we know there's a huge focus on mental health, particularly now. It would be really great to kind of hear all of your perspectives, particularly Mark and Jackie, on how employers can really create an authentic financial well-being strategy, and that which is aligned with educational needs and kind of shifting that stigma. Jack, if you want to kick that off.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. So we do a lot of work in this space with our employers, building out from the pension scheme. And I think there's a couple of things I would pull out. So one is we've created a financial well-being hub that is really a source of information with some tools that can support employees, because of course some of this is quite personal and people do not want to be sharing with their employer issues around debt, for example, or very specific money worries. However, they are happy to access support services through their employer. So that's one of the things that I think is quite important, that whatever you build out in your financial wellbeing strategy, that you are recognising the sort of privacy element of it and some of the things that will be very personal to individuals. Now, in that financial wellbeing hub, the way that we've set it up is really around financial lives. So things like, saving and getting on the housing ladder, buying your first house, thinking about your retirement and some of the early things that you can do to make a plan and what things you should be thinking about. And there's also some stuff around just creating better savings habits. You can't actually buy products on it. That was a deliberate strategy on our part when we've designed that hub. It's actually all about the educational side of it and getting people thinking about what their needs are. And then from there are links where people can follow the trail through, but we've tried to make sure that people aren't just seeing it as a sort of product push, certainly from our perspective. Now, the best way to launch something like that and a portal like that is accessible on your mobile or on your tablet, the best way to do it is through sort of guided sessions. And we do a stack of webinars with some of our employers. And we work hand in glove with the employer around the communication channels they've already got established. I think that's quite crucial, that we're communicating in a way that employees are familiar with. But employers are hugely pivotal in getting employees along to these sessions, giving them the time to spend thinking about their finances and making a plan. So, you know, that would be one of my things that I would put out there to the employers that are on this webinar. You know, really think about how you create the space and make it a safe place that people can really take charge of their finances and access some of those resources. And I think the whole digital thing, actually thinking about some of the generational things here, the more that you can make available that are in medias that are more engaging, the better the take up. So we are doing a lot of stuff that is little sort of short videos, little infographics, that sort of thing. Those are far more popular than things that require a bit of effort and a lot of reading.
Great, thank you, Jackie. So for me, Adrian, I think if we just take a step back, you asked, you know, where I started. So think back 25, 30 years and think about people's ability to access advice. Back in 1990, there were 315,000 financial advisors in the UK to serve a population of 55 million. So there'd be a ratio of one advisor for 115 clients. If you roll that through 30 years on to 2020, then there is only 25,000 financial advisors to serve a population of 65 million. So now we have a ratio of one advisor to 1,716 clients. That on the basis that 2/3 of the population need advice. And I say that because I think it's essential that, you know, as part of this webinar, as directors, we recognize our role in trying to plug the gap of access to advice. So in building on saying, in my prior answer, listen, we need to make sure there's access and we need to make sure that it's relevant. I think Jackie's just touched on something exceptionally important, which is education. So education and allowing and facilitating education for every employee that is really very important. But in addition to that, I would add, where does an employee facilitate guidance? So I've been educated, how do I get guidance to what I think may be important to me? And as importantly, advice itself. Where do I get advice? And I think that employers have a responsibility to think about how it facilitates not just education, but also guidance and advice, and should be connecting with firms such as ourselves to ensure that takes place.
That's really helpful. And we actually just got a question in the chat around that advice gap. They asked if there's been any progress made or matters getting worse. And clearly, Mark, your perspective is that matters are getting worse. Clearly the case with less advisors per person in the UK. Yeah. And then I guess we could maybe just go a little bit deeper into how we bridge that advice gap. And maybe that could even, you could speak a little bit about what Schroders is doing to help us to bridge that, or, you know, are we seeing a move towards getting more advisors, you know, into the field of advisorship so that, you know, there's more people who can provide that advice gap? How are we working with the government, et cetera?
Great. So if I just talk a little bit about Schroders and maybe talk about the industry. So I think the compelling point is that the 315,000 has fallen to 25,000 over that window. And technology hasn't bridged the gap. So people are still left thinking, where do I get my education? Where's my guidance? Where's my advice? And I think we're in that sort of interregnum period where we need to find a bridge. So certainly from a Schroders perspective, what we are doing is we're growing our advisory force. And as part of our strategy, we're definitely adding technology because our mission actually is to give more advice to more people than any other institution. So we're driven by wanting to get advice more accessible to more people at a lesser cost point. But it is difficult because the average age of a financial advisor in the UK today, and I'm sure if you can probably think about your financial advisor, what I'm going to say to you now probably doesn't surprise. The average age is 57. So it's not only, Adrienne, that we've got to grow the base, we need to bring the average age of the advice downward, as well as building the technology. And I think the way that we're going to do this is that for the more simplistic commoditized products, technology will start to serve that. And I think what will start to happen for the clients that really need guidance to fulfill, we're going to start seeing a hybrid where people take technology to a point, are uncertain as to whether they are able to complete and maybe have missed something and will fulfill that with advice maybe in this format, video based or telephony based. And then we will still require, I think, face-to-face advice for the more complex areas. So if I was to say to each one of the directors on this webinar, as you come to your retirement point and you think about your decumulation journey, should you take that from your savings, from your pension, or from your home? And 51% of all wealth is tied up in one's property on average in the UK. That's quite a difficult decision and very difficult to do via technology. So I still think that face-to-face for the more complex decisions will be made. But I think it's a combination of those three, Adrian, that will help us bridge the gap.
Awesome. Jackie, do you want to give us a little more insight?
Yeah, the other thing I would just chip in here is I think there's also a recognition that actually for a swathe of the population, it's sort of more basic information and support they might need, and the money, the Money and Pension Service recognise that they need to up their game and provide a better service, particularly for people that probably don't have the savings and the wealth assets to access the advice that Mark is talking about, but actually could be doing with sorting out their finances and putting themselves on the journey towards building up better savings and certainly better retirement wealth. So as part of the launch of the strategy that we should see coming out and the delivery plan associated with it is a recognition that at the moment the services that MAPS provide is quite specific to certain areas, so they've got a debt advice service, that's probably their most popular service, and that's probably more publicly understood, it has a better awareness than the other services that they offer, but they do actually offer support on pensions, particularly people hitting retirement and thinking about their retirement choices, and that's not particularly well used at the moment. So, one of the things will be connecting those things together, creating a more holistic service that really starts to get people thinking about doing some very basic financial planning. And I think that starts to create the pipeline for people that all then create the demand for accessing some of the more sophisticated advice services. We definitely need to get more people saving for the future. Savings levels in the UK have become very polarised, with lots of people not having any savings at all. Under 60% of the population could survive less than 6 months with the level of savings and planning that they've made if they were to lose their job, for example. So I think that these things I think are quite important, and making them very accessible. So signposting them better, raising awareness, and creating more tools where people can do more things themselves as well, rather than being put off that they've got to go through something that they don't feel comfortable with.
Yeah, and to your point, I think it's super important. Workforces are super diverse, and there's clearly a financial resilience disparity across gender and ethnicity. So I think it would be great for Jackie to talk about some of your efforts in that space, as well as how do we give the resources to people based on where they are, because one solution isn't going to work for everyone. One kind of budgeting workshop might make sense for someone who's more advanced in their cycle of savings than someone who might have a history of, social, I guess, issues, disparities that don't have them even ready to start thinking about, saving. It might be more debt aligned. And obviously just in general, the way these demographics kind of function in the well-being and financial space is very different. So I know you've done a lot of work, particularly aligned with gender, but it'd be great to hear about that and how we can empower employers and directors to kind of leverage some of those tools and ways of thinking about well-being from that perspective.
Yeah, sure, Adrian. I mean, inequalities is something I'm really passionate about, and I've done a lot of work in the gender space, but actually there are other areas of inequality as well. So you mentioned ethnicity, and COVID in particular has really shone a spotlight. And some of that's to do with the type of employment people have and the types of jobs, and particularly in the UK, how secure those jobs are. We're seeing an increasing trend towards 0-hour contracts. With the gig economy, more people becoming self-employed, mainly to get flexibility in the workplace. You see that a lot on the gender side, where women are coming out of more secure employed roles to go into self-employed roles, really to get flexibility, particularly around childcare. So what could employers think about? Well, I think the first thing is probably having an awareness on what is going on in your own business. What are the gender inequalities? So you probably already have a grip on things like pay, and pay is one of the big drivers that flows through into things like the gender pensions gap. But actually, there's more to it than that. There are some fundamental things around how we live our financial lives. And it kind of goes back to one of Mark's original points around people talking about finances in a family setting. You know, in the UK, we're quite bad for managing our finances individually and separately. And therefore, what you see is women becoming quite disadvantaged as they go through some of the life stages, particularly motherhood, and having children and taking time out the workforce and not really thinking through the long-term impact on their own personal retirement savings. There are other life events that affect everyone in an adverse way, you know, so things like divorce, separation, bereavement, ill health, all of these things are some of the things that I think you should think about in terms of, you know, how can you support employees? And actually, those are quite key points where people make decisions that can either be a really positive decision for the future, or you could make quite a catastrophic decision that you don't realise until much later on. So in particular, how it affects your long-term financial resilience. So those for me are some of the things that I've seen in the research that we've done along the way. You know, people make decisions in the here and now. They think about the bills they've got. They think about their immediate responsibilities, and they don't really think, oh my God, I've just actually halved the amount of money I'm saving into my pension because I've decided to go back part-time, for example. So that's one of the things I've been discussing with the Money and Pension Service through the gender lens, you know, creating more tools that allow people to model and forecast the impact of some of those decisions, actually, because we don't really live linear lives and careers anymore, maybe as we did sort of 50 years ago. So, you know, helping people be aware of some of those impacts as they're making those really important decisions.
That's awesome. And Mark, I know, you know, you guys are doing a lot with the blend of technology and the actual human experiences and trying to really engage the younger generation of wealth and that transfer of wealth that's inevitable. It'd be really interesting because for me, like, I don't know if I would go to Money and Pension Service to kind of get that level of education. I want something more engaging. So how do you make it cool? What resources, how are you thinking about education from like a younger generation and really getting in the workforce, like, I guess, engaged behind it? Because I feel like a lot of directors struggle with, like, we have this, you know, tool that we use, but we're not seeing great take up or usage. Like, what are you guys thinking about in that space?
Yeah, so I think you're touching on something which is very dear to my heart, which is engagement in financial services. And actually, it comes for the most part from Adrian around the language that's used by financial services company. They seem quite stiff, and doesn't feel realistic, and it doesn't feel emotionally connected. So we're working very hard to think about emotional connection, and the voice that we use actually is, and I'll try and do this on the webinar. It's going to be quite difficult without the imagery, but I'm going to do my best. So if you can all wind yourselves back to when you were the age of 10, and think about the film that you were watching when you were 10. That could have been Star Wars or Superman or something that made you feel quite special, quite connected to something that felt quite good. And you think about your parents saying to you, listen, I'm going to go on a skateboard, I'm on my roller skates, something like that, and you've got your little helmet on. And what we've created is a rocket boy and a rocket girl. And these people are actually sitting in a field. And this is the essence of what we're trying to change here, is that they're looking up at the stars with this infinite possibility of what their lives could actually be. And you all remember feeling that when you were 10, no matter where you came from. And what we really want to do is bring that back to people. And the sentence that I use that goes along with the rocket boy, rocket girl is, money is just the fuel for the rocket. What I really want to do is go somewhere. And that's what we're trying to do here, Adrian, is we're trying to say to people, where is it that you truly wish to go? So in part it's security, but for the most part, you know, we say that your dream is only a plan away. It's not about wealth. It's not about who has the most money. It's about what is personal to you. And what we want to do is create more conversations of that nature with more people that is more connected to the age group. You know, trying to have a millennial talk to a 57-year-old wealth advisor is quite difficult. You know, our academy, where we've grown our advisory base, you know, I'm proud to say, you know, is ethnically balanced, is 50-50, gender, average age 32. You've got more chance of having a dynamic, emotional, connected conversation, relationship, you know, that has education, guidance and advice within it that feels relevant. And I think it's a combination of all of those things, but the industry has to take its turn, you know, has to stand up and be more relevant to society today. Because we are, as you know, Jackie said, you know, as a society, we don't talk about money. We need to talk about money because it is important, not because we're trying to all be wealthy, but it's important because it's about security and a sense of calmness and not having money worries influence your life. And I think we as an industry have really got to drive to that. And I want to play my part in making sure that happens.
I love that. And to your point, I think it does really fall on the shoulders of organizations to really push that message forward, making sure they're presenting creative opportunities to engage with your money. Obviously, we know that financial well-being and money worries aligns with productivity at work. I think it'd be super helpful, John, if you maybe talk a little bit about that, the importance of investment from like an organizational perspective in well-being as it ties into kind of tackling some of these mental health issues that align with financial well-being.
Sure. I guess I'm reflective back to the 2010, the global financial crisis. And if we remember back then, it was in the UK, the expectation that small businesses would be the engine of recovery. And I know this because I had the privilege of being at Lloyds Banking Group, responsible for the lending portfolio across the UK. And it was really, really challenging to help stimulate the economy through Lloyds Banking Group financing loans and investment on behalf of SMEs. Now, if we reflect on what we need this time round to kickstart the recovery, which, you know, is just around the corner, I think it's important that, you know, our small businesses have that confidence. And let's remember, small businesses are small, and so they are, you know, really just the directors who are on the call here. So that confidence needs to come from the directors who have, you know, their personal well-being needs to be, you know, satisfied as well. And directors have had a tough time. So I guess it's incumbent upon directors to, you know, I guess, take time to ensure their well-being, including financial well-being. And I think then, you know, if we take the lead as directors, and we also assume that we should leave no one behind, we can also then help to kickstart the economy with a level of spend that the consumer needs. You know, if we have buoyant, productive workforces in our teams, we're confident as directors to invest, then the people in our organizations will be more confident. That will improve their well-being. But, you know, there are some that just isn't enough, and we've got to reach out and help those who need help most. So what I would say, you know, the work that Schroders have done, the most important thing for me is to highlight the scale of the issue and also the complexity of the issue, which I think is done really well. You know, the level of complexity in this problem, I think, is really well highlighted by the work that Schroders have done. And then I think, you know, it's incumbent upon us all to take the opportunity to seek the advice and to make even a little bit of change, you know, because a little bit of work done by a lot of people is going to have a big impact. So I think by taking, you know, our well-being seriously, including financial well-being, making positive steps forward, investing and spending in the economy, will start to build a better world again. And again, that will have an impact on everyone.
Wow, that was beautifully articulated. And I think it's a great transition into our Q&A. Loads of insight there. Thank you guys so much for your transparency and kind of bringing your passion to the table. One of the first questions we have is, given the predominance of housing wealth and the big gap in housing costs between mortgage and rent at the moment, is the declining trend in home ownership going to be a significant influence on financial well-being going forward? I'll let you kick that one off, Mark.
Thank you very much, Adrian. So yeah, there clearly is a strong disparity of rental costs versus housing cost. I think that the difficulty for the younger generation is one of the saving of a deposit, where historically, if we went back 20, 25 years, maybe when John was running the lending element, it was actually the cost of the mortgage rate and the interest rate itself. I'm sure we can all remember as directors where the interest rate was maybe 12, maybe remember the 15 point 15% high point, where it's actually the interest rates that were crippling. What we're seeing is the government is definitely making strides, taking efforts to try and help first-time buyers onto the ladder with shared ownership. But that really is guided that first-time buyer lens. If you have had a broken relationship, a divorce, maybe at a home, I think you are impacted. That's going to be a particularly difficult situation that many people find themselves in. So I think if the supply of housing is any way able to bring down the overarching cost of property, then that's going to help nationwide. I'm not sure that's particularly helping people, and certainly the employees that I have of a younger age in London, where housing costs are particularly high, and I feel that they're being forced out of cities, and that's particularly difficult, I think, in COVID times. And I think also what's coming into the housing market right now is the quality of living, as we're all forced in to lockdown. You know, we've got people who I understand, you know, it's not just about, we think about well-being today. It's not just the cost of the property, it's the environment that you're living within. There's definitely, I've seen a trend in that over the last, certainly over the last year. And I've really felt for people who maybe 28, 29 have strived to buy their first place in London, only to find they're locked up in somewhere quite small. And I found this last 12 months particularly difficult. And I think the balance of just thinking about well-being of the home and the office, and that balance of having to close offices and the impact that it has on mental well-being and financial well-being for me has been particularly a difficult decision, and one that I've made for the right reasons, but I found that particularly difficult. So I'm sorry, I'm weaving a little bit of well-being and housing, but I hope that answers your question.
Awesome. Jackie, I think you want to add something, yeah?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. So one of the things that we have been looking at is, is there some policy changes here that could help this situation? Because you're absolutely right. I think we crossed over the threshold last year where there are more people now renting than owning a house in the UK, which is quite a significant position compared to where we would have been 10, 20 years ago. Now, when we look at retirement planning and some of the rules of thumb that existed previously when you were saving for retirement, it assumes that by the time you retire that you own your house and you're no longer paying a mortgage or rental costs. If you are still paying those costs, you need to save an awful lot more before you can retire, and that has all sorts of ramifications. One of the things we've been discussing with the DWP is, could you leverage the auto-enrolment system? And auto-enrolment, as many of you will know, is a mandated position where people have to be put into a pension scheme. There has to be contributions from the employer and from the individual. And one of the biggest things is it's really tapped into a proportion of the workforce that probably wouldn't have saved for retirement otherwise, because it doesn't require them to make any decisions. It all just happens for them. Money comes off their payroll. So, I think there could be an opportunity to consider, could you build that out and create some sort of mechanism that you could take money out of that for your first house? I mean, it would need to be quite tightly managed, or you could erode all your pension savings. But the whole idea of that mechanism where it's made easy for you and almost done just as part of you earning a salary does feel an opportunity to try and create at least some opportunity for individuals to get on the housing ladder.
Awesome. So I'm going to return back to kind of a part two of a question, which is around education and well-being in schools, colleges, and universities. I guess kind of really understanding what the financial services sector is doing for people outside of the workplace as it relates to education. And anyone can kick that off.
I'll go first. So I think the main area is through the banks, actually, and through the channels where students, for example, are taking out their student accounts, or in fact setting themselves up for what will be their adult accounts, moving out of their sort of maybe their child savings account. That's the biggest opportunity. There are some things that various banks are doing in this space to try and add on to that, some educational support, particularly around budgeting and just managing money. And that feels like the biggest opportunity. How can you just build on that a little bit more? Because obviously as a student, there's a bit of a double-edged sword there. You're getting access to these accounts for the first time, but we also know that students can run up an awful lot of debt, both in terms of student loans, but also through some of those accounts. And I think that is quite a crucial point to really start building in some education around managing money better, budgeting, and also the perils of perhaps debt building up and not being affordable. So there is definitely work there. I'm sure there's more that could be done, and that is, as I said earlier, an area that MAPS are trying to look at. Where are the best examples, and can they try and build out more of that centrally as well?
Great, thank you, Jackie. I'll answer this from a slightly different perspective. So I actually think that the industry overarchingly is not doing enough, but I would equally articulate that there are three parties that need to do more. So firstly, the government has to place, financial awareness and financial education in the core of its syllabus for children in a more entertaining way, Adrian, to talk about the way you described it before. So we have to have children more educated and more engaged in what it means. It's not just sums here, but equally, I think the third party is the industry, the government. The third is the regulator, be that the FCA or the PRA, when they have a mandate that is not to close out the three gaps. So the three gaps for me are the protection gap, the savings gap, and the pensions gap. If we have a regulator whose mandate is to close those gaps, you end up with a very different set of behaviours. Our regulator today is tasked with actually removing poor advice. And clearly we need to remove poor advice, but we must be focused on reducing the gaps that exist. As we talked about renters and mortgage owners, the debts that we have in protection, savings and pensions continue to rise year on year. And we have to start with the children. I think there's children in school, and we think about children in school, and I know this from my own personal experience, having children at university, they are ill prepared. They are ill prepared to think about university and how to budget through that university. And without speaking to me, they would not know the housing ladder at all. What does it mean to get a mortgage? How do I save? What does it mean? How much do I need to save? And it's this type of education that the industry, along with government and the regulator, needs to take into account. But in this environment, I think as directors, we each have a responsibility to think about that lens when we think about our employees, because there's a win-win for me. There's a win because hopefully that 27% of respondents and the 48% that Lee talked about that affecting that person is clearly affecting their performance in the workplace. It's affecting them at home, and it's affecting maybe loyalty, it's affecting absenteeism. So there's a win-win for everybody to engage in financial well-being and the broader mental well-being of our employees. And I think it's for each and every one of us here to take that step.
That's awesome. Very helpful. I think we've kind of made it through all of the questions in some capacity, if not answered previously through the panel discussion. I'd love to just do a quick round of your biggest takeaways. If you could leave the directors on the call with one thing around workplace, financial well-being and strategy, what would that be? And I think we have another one coming through, but if we want to, Mark, if you just want to kick that off.
Yeah, so for me, I would say for every one of us that leaves this call today, please go back, look at your own company and think, am I making financial awareness for every one of my employees? Is the communication relevant to the employee force that I have based on the demographic? Am I giving the education? Am I allowing and facilitating guidance and advice? Because if we're all doing that, then we're taking that right step forward. But I'd say, please go away, look at your own company and think, am I doing everything that I possibly can do, given the impact that our Money and Wellbeing report highlights?
And I'll just build on that, Adrian. I would say your role as the employer is actually probably the most crucial. You have probably got the most influence over any other body in terms of what those employees will think about and what steps they will take. So even if you're just doing a facilitation role, but the more you can do to dial this up, the more influence you will have. People really trust their employers and they spend a lot of time at work. So, you have such a pivotal role in really getting information out and really supporting people sort of taking charge of their financial lives.
Thanks. And I think on a similar vein, what I've been struck by most in the last few weeks working with the Schroders team on this is it's down to personal leadership. Jackie and Mark have used the reach and scale of Schroders to produce this report with their colleagues, and it I think it's had a massive impact. And equally, we can use our leadership to have an impact. And I guess all I would ask, and I know Schroders have the same view, is that in making that impact, we leave no one behind. So thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Mark. Great piece of work.
Thank you, and thank you, John, and thank you for hosting, Adrian.
Thank you so much. I will hand it back over to Aidan.
Listen, thanks very much, Adrian, and thanks to the whole panel. If I just add my final takeaway, and I'll just steal a phrase, Mark, that you used about that emotional connection and the importance of the emotional connection, whether money is just a fuel for the rocket, as you said, or it is effectively life changing in terms of making important decisions. Getting emotionally connected with our employees as leaders and directors of our business, I think financial well-being, as you pointed out, is so important as we work our way through this crisis. So to Lee, to Jackie, to Mark, to Adrian, to John, thank you so much for giving us those insights. And thank you to all of those who participated and asked the questions. As many who have not been able to participate, we'll reach out to through our IoD network because this has been recorded. But equally, for those of you that are on that want further information or advice, please do get in touch with either Kirsty or Patricia, Kirsty Livingston or Patricia Huth at IoD in Scotland, and they'll be very, very happy to keep those connections or help to make those connections for you. So with that, thank you all, and I wish you a pleasant day.